Hello, welcome everyone. This is a probably futile attempt to design a mega game in an hour. Now, for those of you who have joined, you should see the option to participate in a poll. We have had 4 suggestions of possible themes for this game that we're going to design. So if you want to start off by voting in that, that will be our first curveball in terms of the direction that this takes. While you guys are voting, Becky is suggesting switching to gallery view. Chris, do you know how to do that? I think I'm in gallery view.
It's gallery view, it's all good.
Okay, great. Incidentally, you'll see in the chat, by default, it's set up to send messages to all panelists. I suggest you change that to all panelists and attendees, just so that chat's comments get shared with everyone, unless you particularly want to say something secretly and privately to the panelists. So while you guys are voting on that, I'm going to ask my guests to introduce themselves. So we'll start with John Keyworth.
Hi, I'm John. I designed Relics of the Fall, and I ran last year, which was may or may not have been a mega game. Run things through Reading Megagames usually. Yes, a lot of games in the works, but yes, those are the ones that have been finished and done, dusted.
Awesome, cheers, John. Alex?
Hey, I'm Alex Beck. I run Horizon Megagames, that runs lots of games in London in normal times and occasional ones online at the moment. I'm also a designer. I've designed 3 games, Crisis in Elysium, Mirrorshades, and Monster Will Mansion, which I'm sure some of you have played somewhere around the world.
Okay, and Mr. Mizon?
I am John Mizon. I run Southwest Megagames, running Megagames all across the southwest of the United Kingdom, and I design my own Megagames as well, including Den of Wolves being the one you've probably heard of, and some others that you probably haven't. Okay,
thanks, guys. Chris, we can probably close the poll now and see what we've been landed with. Okay, so there is, by a small margin, the decision is that we're going to design a Western themed mega game. So the first step of this will be that the 3 of you, I'm going to leave the actual hard work of designing up to. So in a minute, I'm going to share a link to a Miro board. And if the 3 of you want to spend the next sort of couple of minutes just thinking of what the core concepts that we would need to include in a Western mega game is, and just popping up post-it notes on the board in the concepts pane for that. And while you're doing that, normally for one of these sessions, I would do the considerate thing and give people silence, but this is a panel, so what I'm going to do is carry on rattling on while these guys try and work out what concepts should be included in the game. I'm also going to share a link to the Miro board. So in a minute, I'll be sharing my screen. Who's this? Is this Rob suggesting that we include some mechanics from Bang? Thank you, Rob. We'll take that into consideration. I'm sharing a link to a Miro board where the guys are just putting down post-its to suggest different things that could be elements in the game. In a minute, what we'll try and do is narrow it down and work out what sort of the key things are, what the high-level concepts are, and how we go from there. So yeah, in terms of thoughts about general mega game structure, which you're going to have a fair bit of from me during this, for better or worse, it's very tempting to start designing a mega game with just sort of, oh, this one cool idea, or this one interaction. But like pragmatically, the joy of mega games comes from the really messy interactions between different factions within the game. And so generally having the sort of the entire ecosystem mapped out is vital to having the game design work. And then you can kind of start to work out within that ecosystem how the different components interact and so forth. So this isn't the end of generating new ideas, but the first thing I'm going to do is start sharing my screen. Okay, that is disabled, Chris. This is where more pre-prep would have been a good plan. Are you able, Chris, to enable me to share my screen?
You should be able to share now.
Thank you very much. So I am going to be sharing my screen, which will show the mirror board, so you can watch along. But I have also posted the link to the mirror board in the chat. So if you prefer to just log into Miro directly and watch what's going on, then you're more than welcome to. So what do we have here? So there's a fair amount of overlap, and I'm going to start dragging things about. But if you guys want to come off mute, and each of you in turn, so we'll go in the same order as before. Mr. Keyworth, if you want to start, just sort of reading out the key elements you've put in and like giving us a bit of articulation on what each of them are.
Okay, so I mean, I did shootouts, which seems pretty central to most Western things. Certainly, if you can make it, I'm imagining some kind of big moment where you sort of pause the game, you have a shootout, it's very quick, and then it's done, and then someone's on the floor, and then you move on, like a big central sort of dramatic moment that you can sort of imagine triggering a few times through the game, a bit like a wolf attacking 10 of wolves, that sort of thing. Like would be kind of cool. Yes, I sort of put in lawmen and outlaws and lawmen. We've got lots of other people write that as well. Gold rushes will fit in with the sort of, yes, whatever the economic game is. I think we've got a sort of between homesteaders and business owners and ranchers and gold rushing people, we've got the sort of some kind of economic sim starting to form over there. Yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Alex, do you want to quickly talk back the bits that you've
Yeah, so I started with cowboys, obviously central to the theme. I imagine lots of players, if not all of them, would be playing some form of, cowboy, or at least, a variation with lawmen and outlaws and things that John talked about. Also the horses, obviously another key part of the genre. So whether that would be like, I don't know, sort of almost like an equipment thing where you have a card for your horse, how good they are or something. I don't know. Obviously cards, obviously. But I guess there could even be like a horse riding mini game of some kind. I don't know.
Love it.
Homesteaders threatened by outlaws. I guess that was kind of a vague thematic over a sort of thing that could happen. If we have a town and an economic game, maybe they get attacked by outlaws from time to time. So the players have to come and save the day. And then we've also had cavalry save the day. I have no idea how that really sticks with anything else in this game, but it felt it's a key phrase from the genre, so I thought I'd throw it in. Right? Yeah, not sure how that would work, but maybe an end game thing.
Yeah. Okay, and John.
Yeah, so when I'm designing a mega game, the first thing I try to do is sort of like, what's the actual setting? What's the scenario? What are you simulating? So my thoughts go straight to like, you've got the gangs, and those could be your bandit gangs, your evil gangs, or your good cowboy, good cow people. And you've also got, sort of your in between your anti-heroes who are maybe just a lot more mercenary. And then you mix that in with like the sheriff and the town and the business owners or ranchers. I think John Keyworth referenced this as well, sort of like you start building an economic system, right? Like, so it's not just, violence and fighting. There's like a system in the middle of it that's being input and output. And someone mentioned trains, which made me think train robbery would be an interesting sort of activity that you could factor in there. Someone that's just horses. Could there be a team of horses? This is my extremely serious suggestion that we must build upon, and definitely shouldn't just throw away to the side at all.
Excellent. Okay, so what I've also discovered is that while I'm sharing my screen, I can't see the chat. So I shall rely on you guys to keep an eye on the chat and the Q&As, and generally respond to and call out any valuable contributions that get made there, which is minor irritation, but there we go. So with that said, let's what I should have done probably. So we've got sort of, I think, 2 or 3 key areas here. We've got the sort of the economy of the town or towns or homesteads that exist within this Western universe. We've got this sort of concept of individual cowboys doing illegal things. And then we've got this rather neat one about trains that I guess somehow, maybe that's part of the homestead game, maybe it's sort of a separate thing. The train companies are linking the homesteads together, but are they necessarily sort of on the same team, or are they seeking to take all the money?
They almost just
and possibly.
So as I say, the trains could just be like almost a universe thing. The railroad eventually just gets built by control almost, and it changes the game. It allows the outlaws to raid it, and maybe brings benefits to the homesteaders and the cowboys.
I think the interesting thing about trains, right, is it brings up the first point, which is like, is this game about like one town in terms of scale, or is this a game which has like 5 or 6 towns or something? And that way, if it's the latter, you could, connect those towns with trains, and that could be an economic or a logistical thing. Or if it's just one town, then maybe, like Alex says, they're just like an asset or a narrative piece.
I think if you're in one town, you could have, if you sort of order goods in on the train, and then the outlaws get a chance to raid it on the way in, and then they arrive and everybody gets their goods. It's a sort of a way of pulling things into the economy.
All right. Well, I'm going to throw this one back to the audience. So, Chris, do you want to quickly set up a poll to ask people whether we should have one town or multiple towns? And while that poll is running for the next minute or so, I want to pick up on what Alex said about the idea of horses and sort of people. I got the impression you were thinking of almost like a horse upgrade system.
Yeah, exactly. You start with like an old nag, but eventually you get, a prime. I don't know anything about horses, but a prime horse.
Yeah. So I'm gonna pull that out because I think that's gonna be relevant to us no matter what direction this goes. So obviously the downside of horses as opposed to say motor vehicles is you can't just upgrade them a bit at a time, but we'll focus on that for a moment. So again, what sort of properties do we think horses should have, and how would people go about training or upgrading them or whatever?
Do you want us to throw sticky notes down?
Yeah, drop in sticky notes, or if you have sort of specific ideas, do feel free to call them out as well. But yeah, start by sticking in sticky notes. But yeah, and this is something you sort of see in some mega games and not in others, is the idea of like personal stuff effectively. So the thing that's nice about horses is, well, in this particular context, is that it can be something that is just yours and yours alone as a player. So although usually you're on a team cooperating to a greater or lesser extent with other players, there's one thing that is sort of represents how well you're doing individually. And it's nice to, whether it be sort of, I've seen, in fact, I think this was Alex implemented in Elysium, the idea of sort of gradually assembling little toy cars to represent how well you've done for yourself. So that sort of thing is a really good hook for people, and better yet if they have a feedback into the game.
One thing, Ed, that's being talked about a bit in the chat is what do you do about kind of Native Americans? Would you include them, or is that too much of a worrying subject?
That is, I mean, it's a question that I'm probably going to suggest we skirt away from slightly. I have actually been doing quite a bit of reading recently about Western expansion for other Megagame related reasons. But yeah, the entire period of the Western expansion is just deeply, deeply messy and colonialist and imperialistic in ways that, yeah, I think for this panel, I'm keen to stay focused on game design. There is a really important question to be asked about when you're designing a mega game that's either historical or in a historical setting. How do you handle deeply problematic attitudes from the time? How do you handle the fact that, I mean, the present is quite racist, but the past was generally substantially more racist, etc. And with apologies to our audience, I'm going to brush that question under the carpet for the purposes of this panel, simply because we're trying to design a mega game in an hour, which we're barely going to achieve as it is. But great discussion in the chat, and thank you. Someone's also pointed out that actually horses mostly died in the Old West, and people would generally ride mules and ponies, which is again a fantastic piece of history. And there's a dilemma there for us as to what extent we want to go for accurate history versus sort of tropes.
I mean, you know me, I'm always going to go pop culture tropes. So that's, this is a cowboy movie, not cowboy history, but you guys may disagree.
Yeah,
I think people want the Western and they want the tropes, perhaps.
Yeah. I think again, like having been reading up on some of this recently, there is a lot of fascinating stuff to be looked at in terms of a more realistic Western expansion game, but that probably then looks more at the political level rather than the sort of individual homestead life level. The results of the poll are in, by the way. We're looking definitely at a game that spans multiple towns, so we'll put in a pin in that for the moment and look at what comments we have around horses.
While we're doing that, Chris, there's a big discussion about whether the tone should be, I guess, what the tone should be. Do you want to throw a poll up about that? Are we doing a serious one or a light-hearted movie?
Yeah, no problem.
See what people think.
Cheers, Alex. Yeah, okay, so what we've got here on horses, we've got the idea that a horse would in some sense affect your reputation. So even if it wasn't necessarily the best horse, if it was maybe, I guess, a particularly pretty looking one or whatever, it might just have some inherent prestige being from a rare breed. We've got speed, so that might even affect like how many actions you're able to take in a turn, this sort of thing. Someone's put horses NPC/character bond. What are we going for there?
That's mine. I'm the green post-its. So that's sort of like if you're a player who's into sort of the role play, the character narrative stuff, if someone else has put name ! So obviously it's very important that you get to name your horse, or your horse has a name, and like maybe how much your horse likes you as a thing, and you can add narrative details to what your horse is like, and you can really build on that as like a character narrative of you and your horse and how important they are to you, because you're probably keeping the same one for a long time if you're a certain type of character.
Yeah, I threw the name in there, and I think that's a really important part of Mega Games. It doesn't even have to have any mechanical bits necessarily, but people love that kind of, it adds to the narrative, adds to the role-playing element. People really enjoy that kind of stuff.
I like the idea as well that potentially the whole sort of temperament of your horse and the bond you have with it might be a sort of counterbalance for always trading out for the next best one, so that the idea that the longer you've had it in some sense, oh, fantastic, cheers. Yeah, the longer you've had it, maybe the sort of there are other fringe benefits you get, so that you're not always moving up to the next better model, which, while it's a very mega game thing to do in this setting, would feel thematically a bit weird. That you'd immediately go, well, there's a better horse in town and I've got a bit of spare cash, I'll have the next one going. So for the moment, I'm gonna suggest we put a pin in the horses because we've got some idea
I won't
of.
like that.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. For the moment, I think they're going to feed back into the wider ecosystem once we've got an idea of it, of more of what else is in the game, and therefore how the horses can interact with it. And go on to, so we've got feedback that we're wanting a game with multiple towns. There's a majority, although not a massive majority, but there's a majority for something that's a bit more like the Hollywood myth version of the Western. So with that in mind, let's have a think about the economic game and what that will look like. So we've already got some key elements of the economic game listed, and let's think about like what would be the key elements there that we want to have in and how they would interact. So although the economy may end up not being very player run in this, because in a Western game players, well, maybe some players do want to just build a homestead and make their fortune and not really bother with the whole adventuring lifestyle, but I suspect a majority will want to be out there cowboying rather than drilling for oil and panning for gold and such. But yeah, the economy nonetheless needs to be textured and detailed because it's what the players sort of react to, as it were. So let me zoom in there a bit. Okay. So we've got this concept of sort of gangs and outlaws, which I think for the moment we'll say is outside of the economic game. It's sort of a separate game that impinges on it. Farming game, fantastic. Do we want to include the stuff about the gold rush in the economic game, or would we see that more as part of the sort of cowboy exploratory game?
It's a big question. Is that something that happens halfway through the game and then fundamentally changes the structure of the game? A whole bunch of miners and gold hunters turn up, or is it is it something that's there from the start?
You could start off with some unexplored area that you need to prospect, and then once you've prospected it, you can find that there's a mine there or not, and then you can build the mine and then eventually build up a track to get back to town, and then it suddenly, like, it could be like a fair-sized project that you sort of complete halfway through the game, and then the economy just shifts massively.
Well, almost a little bit of sort of 4X kind of thing where you explore and build a mine. Yeah, I like that.
Nice. Okay, that's great, and so that's great because it's a massive point of interaction with the other part of the game. So
Rob in the chat suggesting we need a brothel for the economy. So I don't know if we want that kind of thing in the game. But
I mean, theoretically, even the Hollywood myth version of the Old West does have brothels, but they're all sort of very cleaned up and no actual sort of.
It's a saloon with 8 extras on the side, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? There's a bit of light flirting, and then we fade to black.
Yeah. But more seriously, it's just a cattle ranching as well, which I think gets.
Yeah, there was a fair amount of cattle ranching in the Old West, and I mean that's why they were called cowboys, isn't it? It definitely includes some of that. Okay, so someone's put town power politics, which obviously is definitely a feature of the Old West. How do we envision that working?
So that was, I put that down. So I was also thinking of mayors. Obviously, a town has to be sort of above a certain size before a mayor makes sense, rather than just a sheriff. But I think if you're able to put mayors in there, it does add some power politics. So I'm thinking less that there's actual democratic elections, which doesn't quite fit the theme as much as I love them, and more like the mayor's in power because there's key people in the town that support them. And if they run out of money or whatever, they're just going to get kicked out by some thug or the sheriff who's taking the equivalent of martial law, but like in the Old West, it's probably a bit less like that and more just like, we don't need a mayor, we need someone who just keeps us safe. So the mayors probably are competing with each other and also really trying to negotiate with the key people in their town who maybe are threatening them or trying to get something out of them. So you've got mayor versus sheriff, mayor versus business people, mayor versus mercenaries, bandits who are threatening the town, all that kind of stuff. and you can have sort of the mayor having more influence over the people, or playing that out. It's so some kind of social element to the NPCs of each town that can act, like make the mayors a significant part of it. And of course, the business people, the sheriffs, etc., can also have like connections and levers and mechanics to that as well.
Nice. Yeah, and so where I'm saying versus, I guess the mayor versus sheriff relationship doesn't have to be antagonistic, but they have different goals. The mayor wants their town to be the biggest and best. The sheriff wants it to be law-abiding and well-behaved. And the business people presumably would have businesses in multiple towns and just be looking to suck out as much money as they can.
Yeah, and before it gets lost in the chat, I've just noticed that Sue suggested like the town's about to be recognized as an official county or something, and that can be sort of an endpoint that has people competing, like which town's going to be the capital of the county seat.
Fantastic.
Or just like it's going to imply more law and order, but also more like transparency and accountability. And there'll be people who prefer individualism and living their own way, compared to people who actually want more law and order, and that's sort of the tension as well.
Yeah, and you then have to sort of think about what the criteria would be for becoming the county seat. Is it as simple as whoever has the most money? Is it bribing someone back in Washington? Is it a bit of sort of power politics again? Is it maybe influenced by how well you've kept law and order, or how well you've influenced like how many businesses you've attracted to your particular town? So there's lots of potential there. It could even be like who's the best rail connected, and then you link back into the railways. So I think we've got like 2 or 3 categories of people. We've got business people who are clearly mostly about building stuff and then taking as much money out of it as possible. We've got the mayors. I'm still a little ropey on what the mayors are going to do. What do we think a mayor would actually get up to?
Well, like I'm saying, is there like a sort of an NPC populace in each town? And obviously the mayor has the most control over that sort of influence. And like expanding on what that means, what that does, getting more into the mechanics of it might be a good idea if we have time.
Yeah. So you've got influencing the local people in a particular direction. I mean, I guess the question is what makes a mayor a mayor? Like, are they the one who funded the creation of the town? Is a mayor just another kind of business person, or are they some sort of federal official who's been sent out there to guide the direction of development?
I feel to get the theme, the mayor is quite often a bit of a corrupt individual. So maybe they're a dodgy local businessman with maybe even connections to the outlaws, and the cowboys and the lawmen have to stand up to them a bit, maybe.
So would it even be the case that mayorship is just something the business people are competing for, but it's a prize that comes with strings attached because suddenly you've got a lot of responsibilities on top of your new title?
It's something that could move around during the game almost, rather than being.
Possibly, yeah.
Or are we thinking it's a role that? Because I was imagining it'd be a role that would be stuck, and maybe even you're the leader of the bad guys, or whatever it might be. But
I could see it working either way. Its own role with defined, separate, unique mechanics, or a title that players get somehow. Sort of like in the Battlestar Galactica board game, you can be the president or the admiral just by passing the card around based on certain actions.
Maybe that's another poll. Is the mayor a thing you win in the game, or is it just a role?
Thanks, Alex. Yes, let's do that. What do people think? Either one feels like a valid approach. So what do people think in the chat? Should we be looking at the mayor hat being passed around, or is it more interesting, or do we want to go for?
Can we get a poll for that?
Yeah, Chris, are you still in there?
If we've got multiple towns, we can have a slightly different ecosystem within each of them. So one, you've got the corrupt mayor, but the business people are sort of vying for, and another one makes a bit nicer and a bit more get along kind of people.
Well, I hadn't thought of that multiple mayors actually. I was assuming there'd be one big town, but you're right. Yeah, you could have several mayors, couldn't you?
Didn't we vote for multiple towns?
They did. You're right. Yeah, I just assumed when he won mirror roll, but no, that makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
Someone in the chat mentioned asymmetric town. Like, how asymmetric are the towns? Are they very the same mechanically or narratively? How different are they between the towns?
Yeah, I think in a sense, the fact that we've gone for multiple town exploration game almost gives us that for free, just in the sense that the town that is closer to civilization and is the route the railway naturally comes in by has an inherently different character to the town that is sort of near towards the mountains and maybe is nearest to the gold when it's found and so forth. Maybe that's too simple, and maybe we do need to impose some more stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, well, we did mention the idea of sort of a tension between order and chaos, or perhaps more accurately, like big government and small government. And like you could have that, like the town that's sort of doing better off for itself is just literally geographically closer to civilization, and then the other towns which are further out, and that, you know, there's a real tension there. People are there because they like having a lot of control over their own lives, whereas, you know, the other towns, they're like, well, it's good for business if we have more, you know, foreign investment kind of thing. By foreign, I mean like the rest of the country.
You could also vary the level of sort of, you know, outlaw or criminal kind of influence on each town. Some of the towns that maybe that are further out are a bit more run by the outlaws. There's less law. Maybe they don't have a sheriff or whatever it might be.
Love it. I mean, there's potential there for a sort of culture wars thing, isn't there, as well? That like effectively every town has a sort of maybe starting position in terms of level of law and order, how sort of capitalist versus sort of homesteady they really are. Like what percentage of the town is owned by big business versus is sort of small independent settlers, and then those sliders might move as the game goes on to represent the shifting trends, and there's a bit of a fight to keep the Old West free versus the big businessmen who just want to own the whole thing.
So question on the chat, which is interesting. What's the time scale of the game? How long does each turn represent? I guess it depends if we are having gold rushes as an event and the railroad being built, or whether that's all just kind of in place. Like we should think of it.
Yeah. So we've had an answer back from the poll that in theory they're pretty keen on the mayor card being sort of passed around and that being something players fight over. So without do we want to have another poll for the timescale, or do we think it's easier just to pick?
I think even if we're having a poll, we should have some more kind of thoughts. So like, obviously you could go super narrow with like each turn represents a day, or maybe like several hours, probably more like a day or 2 days. And it's very sort of individual character focused. I think probably more likely longer than that. So I'm thinking each turn is 2 weeks or a month or a couple of months. And like the towns can develop a little bit and the narratives can be a bit more complex and a bit less personal in some ways.
I think you're right. If we're talking about an economy of towns and farming, I think that's a very different game to one where it might be spread over, you say a few days, whereas there's the showdown or the OK crowd at the end.
And then you've got the other extreme where like each town is like a year or two, and like you could actually have the towns develop in extremely significant ways. But yeah, again, that's probably too far away from what we've already got in terms of local development.
I mean, with 1 month per turn, you could almost squeeze it into a year, which you'd have. It's quite nice to have a year because you've got a sort of natural cycle of
have seasons affecting the farming, and
or maybe one season per turn, or something, something in that kind of time scale.
Months roughly, is it?
It sort of feel like weeks and months are the same option.
Yeah.
I guess differentiates the overall length of the game, right? So you've got 10 to 12 turns. Weeks only gets you 3, a single season. 1 month lets you have multiple seasons, I suppose.
It's does the whole game last 2 months or does it last a year kind of deal? So
better way of putting it probably.
So the answers are rolling in for that, and while people are
really voting, split at the moment.
we've got a sort of we've got a trend towards the middle options, so it's going to be a few weeks or a few months, it's looking like. But yes, the trouble with having a 4-option poll is how do you
I think we can sort of add the weeks and months answers together in a sense.
That's it. It's certainly a good way of rigging it to get the answer we want. But,
Yes,
It is.
it's our game. We'll do what we like.
Excellent. Democracy in action, people. Okay, well, we've got a tie between
tied anyway,
weeks
so
and
that's
months anyway.
very appropriate.
So we'll say they
fortnightly turns it is then.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
Compromise each turn is exactly 3 weeks. Halfway between 1 week and a month.
Excellent. Great. So let's dive into and I wanted to very quickly zoom back to this thing about having the mayor card passed around, because John said, and I think rightly, you wouldn't really have an election in this sort of setting. It's not that sort of setting, but in that case, can we dive in quickly to what sort of mechanics we think would exist around who gets to be the mayor and where and for how long?
Is it almost just, if it's something that basically a local, bigwig declares I'm the mayor, and if everyone sort of agrees they go along with it, it could almost just be a resource without a rule. It's just a card, and it's up to the players to use it to trade and negotiate.
Yeah, I think it's extremely sort of soft power, like because there's no election. It's just sort of who do all the important people compromise enough on agreeing the person who should be the mayor. I don't know how you gamify that. As Alex said, it could almost be like literally just consensus or a majority vote that you do like very quickly without too much hubbub.
Yeah. So I mean, at that
force
point,
it away from someone. Yeah, and what I was thinking is, people are asking, what does being the mayor mean? I mean, for one thing, you can have some obvious prestige things, but I think one interesting thing would be like they can set, collect, and distribute taxes, which obviously the major thing that affects everyone. Everyone would probably want a bit of, but also something that you could get unpopular by doing the wrong way, and of course, a thing you could be super corrupt with.
Yeah. So we give the mayor some fairly key powers, like the ability to give land grants in whatever area around the town is defined as the town charter, that sort of thing, so that they've got a lot of quite concrete power. But like you say, I guess the other question would then be would you track the mayor's popularity, or is the mayor's popularity really just like they're the mayor until enough of the town decides that they don't want them to be?
If players want to, they can like trigger a more Western version of a no confidence vote, right? And like if they get a simple majority or something, then that person is no longer the mayor and they have to make a new one. And like you can sort of you can trigger that if you've got like 3 or 4 players who all agree it needs to happen, kind of thing.
Yeah, a town hall kind of meeting that they have.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, "Oh, we don't like this mayor."
If the current mayor dies, which I'm sure would never happen.
Re-elect the mayor.
Oh,
yeah.
Good grief! Where did you get that from? Yeah. So I think we are essentially this is. I mean, the concept of a posse showing up to boot the mayor out of office is a pretty solid Western trope. So the idea that if you get a certain minimum number of players, then you kick off the power struggle, and then the mayor has to get together their own posse. Would we say that to get together a posse, you have to have a replacement in mind, or would it be as simple as I'm not happy, we're throwing down?
I imagine that players would generally have a replacement in mind if they were doing that. So I don't know if
you probably don't need to police that.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah,
that makes sense. Okay, so then effectively what we're getting at is that each player inherently has a certain amount of this sort of soft power. Would it just be one person, one vote, or would we allow people to sort of build influence within the NPC community and effectively multiply there?
So you probably need to be able to put in influence and or gold to dollars.
I'm thinking, what if it is one player, one vote, and then very organically, if you're wealthy, you can pay other players to vote a certain way, and that way you can buy votes, but in an extremely organic way that's done by players.
How are we representing kind of NPC voters? I'm assuming it says a town of even just a few hundred people, we're not still going to be all played. So
yeah. I mean, if we're saying that it's not like an actual democratic vote, it's more about the soft power of who the people in the town accept, then you probably don't need to include NPCs unless you have like actual NPC shopkeepers and ranchers and business owners that you want to include for other reasons in other parts of the game. You could bring that in for them.
You can certainly make an argument that each player has roughly the same following, and that can't change. And there's pros and cons to that. There's potential for an interesting mechanic in there where a player can spend all game working on building a following and then get to dictate terms to other players. But if they're just doing that in a mechanical sense, bribing locals or whatever, maybe that's less interesting than them actually having to do it in a
it's true.
negotiation in the room sense.
You can have popularity or like influence over the common folk as being a stat or a resource in and of itself, and that could be useful for expending in who gets the mayor, and also if there's any instability, people are going to kick things off, or like you just want to force an issue through control as a free-form thing. That's also potentially something that could come into play.
Ed, you might not have seen it. Chris was warning us. We've got less than 15 minutes. So.
Great. Okay. Well, let's delve into then a couple of the other things that we haven't talked about much. One of which is this concept of exploration, and the other one of which is trains. And I think these probably link in pretty neatly with each other.
What about shootouts? We haven't covered shootouts.
What about shootouts? Fantastic. Okay.
15 minutes.
Sorry, John.
Say again, John.
Probably do a whole shootout mechanic in 15 minutes rather than half a exploration or half a train mechanic.
All right. Should we delve into then a very detailed mechanic around shootouts? That sounds great.
Rob started with a really good point. It should start off with kind of a showdown, a face-off, and then you've got to have a quick draw, and then you get the extra shooting. Something along those lines.
I'm thinking quick draw showdown. There's a lot of sort of risk-reward concepts in there, like a tension of do you go too early or too late kind of thing. You could wait for longer to guarantee a more accurate shot, or you shoot early and that way you shoot first, but you'll probably be less accurate and you're not sure what your opponent is going to do.
So when we talk about shootouts, are we imagining the classic sort of 1 versus 1 type scenario, or is it more the sort of Mexican standoff, loads of people in loads of different places? Because
if you had a Mexican standoff, you could have quite a fun mechanic maybe where if you worked out sort of rock, paper, scissors thing, you just have everyone with a hand in their pocket and then 3, 2, 1, and then you do something at someone, and then
rock or scissors, or
Oh, what's that game that you're all gangsters and you're trying to steal things?
Cash and Guns is
Cash and Guns. It's very Cash and Guns.
Can we just steal that mechanic wholesale because it is really good?
Probably.
You have lives and bullets.
I mean, Cash and Guns obviously has player elimination, which is toxic in a mega game, but I think the whole
eliminate from the combat, not you'd have to just dead.
Well, Cash and Guns also has a wound system where you get 3 wounds before you die. So we could have a similar thing where just because you've been shot doesn't mean you're dead forever.
Yeah. So something I was putting into Club 1927 was the idea of if you take enough wounds during the game, your epilogue will probably have you, crippled and dying in hospital or something fairly poor. You get a poor epilogue, but you don't get a poor game. Whereas if you come through and you haven't been shot up, basically, well, at least you've got your health. Ways of keeping people in the game, even if they've been shot, but still giving it that sort of consequence.
Plus, you could have some recast roles, like a lot of people talking about, the encroachment of big government or other things. You could have people playing US cavalry or nearby state officials. Coming in towards the end of the game, recast.
So that's a sort of incentive to not to kill each other, because otherwise these people you hate even more will keep turning up.
Yes. So the more people who die in town, the more the state's we got to come in and bring the law to this place. So the more players die, the more state officials show up trying to regulate everything. Sort of a fun, natural balance.
So
then the sort of natural vendetta won't be the end of the world either, because they'll turn up and they'll have an agenda. And going after the person that killed them won't be the end of the world.
Are you going to have combat in a kind of your quick draw face off, or can you actually just sneak around and shoot someone while they're sleeping? We're going to allow sort of more blunt assassinations.
We've hinted at a reputation mechanic, right? You can lose reputation for not taking someone on honorably, I guess, and that's sort of the cost of doing something like that, as well as, of course, the fact it might not work if they if you bungle the stealth.
You could have that reputation as a shield against that kind of attack. Like if you're surrounded by people that like you and that sort of thing, then people aren't going to be able to kill you in your sleep. But if you're a dishonorable, no good, nobody, and which if your reputation drops when you do those kind of actions, it's kind of you're kind of opting into it.
Like your reputation is almost like a defense in a way.
Yes, yeah, I will be an outlaw and I will do terrible things and I will open myself up for terrible things to happen to me at the same time, and then it's kind of your own fault.
Yeah, interesting. So by choosing to be a bad one, people don't mind if you get assassinated. I mean, I'm always very cautious about allowing assassinations in games for a couple of reasons, and I think the biggest one is just that a lot of the time players don't have any way of seeing it coming, if that makes sense. Like it just comes out of nowhere. Oh, this person was mad at you for something that you didn't even track. Now you're dead. Like it's not an unrealistic scenario in real life, but it's not a very fun way for your game to suddenly end. You need to have been able to see it coming and have been able to do something about it. So I think maybe the idea that no one's reputation starts off bad enough for an assassination against them to be legit. And you can always have that sort of cowboy code of honor thing going on that, that anyone capable of doing that sort of assassination is also unwilling to do it unless someone is objectively so bad that they deserve
what Rob
it.
suggested in the chat, which I do love, is you have to be assassinated, you have to have a wanted poster made for you. Obviously your reputation is low enough, you become wanted, and then people can just kill you wherever, maybe. I don't know.
That could also be another thing for the mayor or the sheriff or both to empower they can do is create wanted posters.
Yes. But yeah, I like the idea that the majority of combat and fighting should be in the showdowns where you can run away from if you're injured. It stops too many dead players, stops too much, kind of negative experience, I think.
Yeah, and I think one thing we found when playtesting Club 1927 was that as soon as the shootout started, everyone wanted to be involved, and so everyone would just converge on the shootout. Whereas I think if effectively there's a bunch of different towns and players are either in a town or they're out exploring, then you maybe have a natural ward against that, because at the start of each turn, players will choose, I'm in this town this turn, or I'm exploring near this town, or I'm in this other town. So if someone does trigger a shootout in town number 7, we'd probably give it a better name. But yeah, then if you weren't there, tough, you don't get to interfere.
Or you could, if you had like a fast horse, you could just expend your fast horse card to get there to help them out.
Yeah.
Because there is a certain amount of, if you want to gang up on someone, you can just see that they're often somewhere on their own and then turn up with a posse, and it is a little bit unfair. If they can bring their allies in by spending something, then it would even it out a little bit.
Yeah, you don't want to push people to only travel in groups, because while there's a certain realism to that, there's also it kills the game for a lot of people because they're forced to stay in groups.
And I think it's a more exciting cinematic thing where the fight's a big, one gang versus another gang. It's a proper, shoot out of the OK Corral. It's not just someone getting mugged, essentially.
Yeah. Okay, so the where we talked about stealing the cash and guns mechanics, obviously the cash and guns mechanics are in a scenario where there are no alliances. You're just all fighting over one central pot, whereas this is more. We're envisioning this will often happen as sort of gang versus gang, maybe some sort of third parties that no one knows if they're going to get in and what way they'll go, but the majority of people know who the enemies are, and it's just a question of who do you shoot first. So I think the key tension in Cache of Guns is who are people going to point their guns at, and then have they bothered to load them? Whereas I think in this setting, people probably are going to always have loaded their guns. It's fair to say.
Probably, yeah.
But it might be a case of the sort of the quick draw that John talked about is probably quite an interesting way of still giving people a decision to make beyond just do I load my gun or not, which is a weird decision to have been given.
Is it more, and this is getting a bit meta, but maybe the cards are not I loaded my gun not, but it's like you only ever hit with 2 of your 6 bullets or something, and it's your choice when you do the hitting, maybe, or I don't know. It's something along those lines. It's more of
a. What you could do is you could give each player like 3 or 4 cards that are just numbered 1, 2, 3, 4 or whatever. You could even use just regular playing cards. And like I was saying, you have like a risk reward thing where you can shoot earlier, but it reduces the odds of you being accurate. And then you just choose 1, 2, or 3, or 1, 2, 3, or 4. With 4 being you'll always go last, but you'll be like 80% chance of hitting, as opposed to 1%, 30% chance of hitting, but you always go first. And you could just expand that out to like any number of players in a sense, and that's where you can get your Mexican standoffs.
Maybe to get that 6 bullets, things quite like that. You could have 2 cards that are duck cards where you don't even shoot, but you're protected from being hit, kind of thing. And it's
but it costs reputation to use that.
Maybe, right.
Yeah.
I had something like that in 2027. I mean, so you could have a if you rather than having cards and percentages to hit, if you had a number of people that need to be shooting at you to take you out of the fight, do you imagine do a rock paper scissors, but you're doing sort of 1, 2, or 3. If you like quick draw, you're doing a sort of a 1, and then you resolve the quick draws. Then once they've all, if anyone's taken out the fight, they're taken out the fight. But then everybody who's not already fired can then kind of retarget with the same sort of number, so that you can do it quick, but you can't really communicate, and you can try and sort of take someone out of the fight, or you can leave someone behind to say, well, maybe on initiative 2, we will be able to re-coordinate and get someone. I don't know, something there, something very simple, basically. Just has a few phases. It still takes that quick draw sort of idea into effect, but without cards and dice and things.
Yeah. I always like having a few cards as options. But
yeah.
So guys, time-wise, we're very, very rapidly approaching the end of our time slot. So a couple of, I guess, final questions, jumping back to a slightly more abstract level. If you were going to try and develop this into a real mega game, not saying anyone has to, I'm going to ask each of you, like, what would you see as the sort of center of it? What would you see as the area that really got all of the detail and the texture and like all of the complexity? If anyone, feel free to jump in. I'll go around each of you, but go on, Alex.
So for me, I think it is the outlaws versus the lawmen, the kind of law versus chaos thing. I think that's where the cinema was. That's what most of the movies are about. So I think that's the center of it for it. Maybe the farming, the homesteading, the exploration is the thing that the lawmen, the cowboys can do, and the outlaws can do. But fundamentally, it's about that clash of those two sides, I think, in the different ways.
Fantastic. Okay, Mr. Keyworth.
Yeah, I don't know. I might kind of going any other way as far as sort of attention for the sort of mechanics are concerned. I do have the idea, if you've got this sort of bedrock of an economy, basically, you've got the railways, you've got the homesteads, you've got the exploration and that sort of thing. What you're doing is you're kind of playing on top of that. And so while the players are doing like that, and their briefs and stuff do all this sort of cowboys and outlaws and ranchers kind of stuff, like the underlying sort of bedrock mechanics are this sort of economic terrain which they're sort of looking at, basically, if that makes
perfect sense. Yeah. So sort of have that detailed simulation there, and then sort of trust that the players will play on top of it.
Yeah, and I think the real interesting thing is sort of, if you put that, for me, it'd be sort of the idea of almost those two ideas sort of put together is like, how does this environment, which you can get resources from, this economic politics situation of mayors and business people and ranchers, how does all those interactions and incentives fuel the violence between law and bandits, and like and you throw into that the pressure from the outside to become more lawful and regulated against the power of individualism. How does that affect the sheriff and the other people with guns? How does that affect all the people with guns and who they shoot their guns at and why, is sort of the real interesting drive.
So I think the moral of the story is I was definitely asking the wrong question in that you can't have, or you miss out on some of the interesting conflict if you don't have an adequate base rock and base scenario to build it off. But at the same time, if you don't have structured, nuanced, interesting characters with interesting motivations, then you're just playing a dry economic game and it also goes nowhere.
Yeah.
Which, yeah,
I think that's what
I like
Megagames
that as an answer.
that board games and role-playing games don't. Not trying to define anything, obviously, but you know, they're where the sort of board games and role-play games meet, because we've got the board gamey simulation and then the role-play roles, and then they smush into each other, and yeah,
there we go.
and
Accidentally
Megagame
we ended up.
babies.
Yeah, it's the structural story, right? It's not, you know, protagonist comes to town, solves all the problems. It's why have these various people come to town, and why do things change once they're there because of the existing socioeconomic incentives and whatnot.
Chris is telling us we have to stop, I'm afraid.
He's not wrong. Well, thank
The
you
Game
guys
of
very
Thrones
much.
of Westerns. But yeah, thanks, Ed.
And yeah, cheers everyone for watching. And yeah, go to whatever the next thing is.
the next thing's my thing, and I've got 2 minutes to go to the loo and set it up.
Okay, we'll let you go then. Thanks everyone. And yeah.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye. Thank you.